I see a screen. I see Adam.
Oh,
Hey,
there he is.
You hear me? I'll disappear. We'll let Adam take it away. I guess.
All right, Japaru. So George, have you ever worked with, or do you know this guy, this Adam guy?
No, is this Marcello?
Is this Marcello? Yeah.
Is this Stain? Who is? Oh, it's Adam. It's Adam.
this?
Sorry, it's a smaller screen.
So, all right. So this is cool. So I'm going to step out and I'm going to let you guys do your thing because you're two grown men who can't get enough of each other and you actually know each other. So George, I'm going to let you introduce Adam.
For sure. So thank you, John, and thanks for coming, Adam. So I got to start working with Adam about 5 months ago, and he is like my best work friend. We talk every day. And if a day goes by that we don't talk, I feel sad. He's awesome. He has an awesome talk. I'll let him do the intro and all that fun stuff. And thank you for mitigating the issue of the power that you had in your home and your town and made it across 2 other towns and eventually are somewhere in some hidden bunker with internet. Take it away.
Exactly. Yeah, thanks, George. No, I appreciate it. And, this talk today, and obviously it's, your adversary within and the golden age of insider threats. And, even though like I'm part of Scythe and work with George and it's very, I'm a vendor, obviously, today's talk isn't really about that. And today's talk is a longer form of a short version of a talk I gave at the last Wild West Hackfest, where it was like a quick start guide to insider threats. And today is the long form of that talk. So if you are interested in that, that's what we're going to be doing here today. And yes, the subtitle here is, of course, the golden age of insider threats. And yes, it's intentionally misspelled. I know, because you are the adversary. Get it? Get it? It's an insider threat joke. Okay, enough of that. So real quick about me, I'm Adam Mashinchi. I do a bunch of stuff. I'm involved with the DEF CON Red Team Village. I'm the village and the contest coordinator for Grey Hat. I'm the head of product for Scythe. I help with the C2 Matrix, and I've got a background in all sorts of stuff. Whatever. That's me. So what are we talking about today? So first off, all the slides will be shared, so no worries there. You'll get the link to this at the end of the show, so you don't have to take a million screenshots or anything like that. But this is going to be a very high-level, fast overview of thinking like the insider threats do from a red team and purple team and blue team perspective. And if you're looking for some explicit tools or commands or GitHub libraries or whatever about how to do those things, that's not what this talk is. This is a way to think about these sorts of topics, a way to present these sorts of topics. If you're looking to maybe propose insider threat adversary behaviors in your organization, this is probably a good talk to help you sell that internally, and really is a level set and some good ideas about how to think about these topics. So that's what we'll be talking about today. And again, here's kind of a more pristine overview of the next 45 minutes or so. One thing I'll talk about early on is post-exploitation and why that is a hypercritical topic. And we've already talked a little bit about that today. Assumed compromise is another name for it, but we'll go into that. We'll also talk about insider threats and end users and why insider threats are kind of a crazy thing, especially now. And then we'll talk about red teaming as the behaving like an internal adversary and the advantages there are there and the values of those things. And then talk a little bit about the blue teaming perspective on the insider threats and some of the trials and difficulties there are there. And then finally, we'll talk about purple team opportunities and, how insider threats have it easy and why boards and leaderships care about these things and some ways to win in that way. Okay. So first off, and this is really part of the lens of this entire presentation here, is post-exploitation as a valuable tool. And really, there's 3 principles that I think as an InfoSec industry we can kind of agree on. One, it's not if, but when. So every single organization has the potential to be compromised. It just is inevitable at this point. And it's really possible, and there's no organization or enterprise that is immune from compromise. 2, there will always be O days or end days or flaws in software, bugs or whatever. There's always going to be a new way in because of flaws, right? And 3, social engineering will always work. So humans are valuable. People will always click the email or plug in the thumb drive or whatever. There's no way to entirely prevent a human actor from doing something that they shouldn't, right? And so if you believe these three principles to be true, well then post-exploitation is kind of more important from an analysis and from a defensive and from an adversary emulation perspective than exploitation, right? So it's not so much preventing the O day in Chrome. It's would you notice if Chrome was now doing things that it shouldn't be doing because it's become compromised, right? And this is really important from the lens of a insider threat, because insider threat actors don't necessarily have to play in the exploit space at all. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit, but I wanted to say this all out loud and say, post-exploitation is really a critical thing to think about. And it's so easy to get wrapped up in defending against CVE that we kind of lose the forest through the trees a bit, especially from an offense and defense perspective. And so let's just play this out one more time to make sure we're all on the same page. But you can pretend, you can make your own do-it-yourself O-day in your organization when you're doing an adversary emulation. And the idea is that you could create a custom binary, and then you add it to your allow list. And assuming the detonation of it, like the activation of that binary is not caught, well, now you are running as if a valid process like Chrome or Office or whatever has been compromised. And so it is really that easy from an implementation perspective to kind of DIY your own O-day, because you don't have to really think about exploitation. You're just saying, oh, something that is approved is now doing something that is not approved. And let's carry forward with that example. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's talk about insider threats as a thing. And the endpoints today it's really problematic. I mean, and we'll talk about a number of examples here. But for the sake of this conversation, an endpoint is really something that a user interacts with. So it's not a web server or anything like that. But this is the largest area of compromised in organizations still. There was a statistic about like 2/3 of compromised organizations are compromised at the endpoint, which is significant. And it's worth noting that there's all sorts of things that people are now, and we'll talk more about bring your own device and all those things. But really, humans are difficult to secure, and obviously the devices that they're using are difficult as well. So people have given up their password for a candy bar. Phishing is prevalent and it works still, obviously. USB drives are things people plug in, obviously. What was it? There was I think it was a Black Hat talk that was done, and 45% of the USB drives they sprinkled in the parking lot got plugged in. And obviously that's just looking at your employees. Well, what about third parties or vendors that you brought in or contracting staff? You have to worry about securing all of them as well. So it's not just your policies and procedures that can help defend you. And so with endpoints being that difficult to secure and users being that difficult to secure, and then you have an extension of that, which is endpoints themselves are really problematic when you're looking at them as a defender. The usage of an endpoint, the laptop, is very difficult to monitor, especially for anomalies, right? Because humans are kind of random. We look at weird websites that people send us links and all sorts of things, and we work in different behaviors, and it's hard to find trends. And then obviously pretending to be a user, like creating a lab environment where you have normal user behavior and then adversarial user behavior all tucked in together, like it's hard to emulate that because humans are super random and weird, and it's hard to simulate that kind of human interaction from an insider threat blended with normal behavior perspective. So given that people like to plug things into endpoints and click on phishing links, and that there are just inherently adversarial folks, well, what do we do about that kind of holistically? And to preface this next point, I do want to say that I really love privacy and security and encryption. These are things that are really important to me. And so I'm not saying that every organization needs to become a surveillance state. However, now is a really great time for folks that are insider threats to do insider threat behaviors. And it's a no-brainer. It's obvious to everybody, especially now in this COVID era where everyone's working from home. But just to itemize a few things. So end-to-end encryption and cool ways to exfiltrate data is so turnkey and so consumer. If you look at all the free VPNs out there. You look at Cloudflare 1.1.1.1 plus Warp, right? It's like instant VPN over DNS, and it's lovely, especially from a threat actor perspective. And then we take another example of Firefox's Send, which was a great tool, was being used maliciously, and it was just great end-to-end encrypted file sharing that you could get for free, and it worked in browsers, and bang, immediate exfiltration. It was so easy to do. And then, of course, there's the bring your own device stuff. So BYOD has kind of won, and MDMs really don't exist in the industry as a whole, and they don't tend to work. And even in controlled enterprises where everybody has strictly enforced policies on their workstation, executives have non-managed devices. And then, there's this whole other aspect of now that everyone's working from home, and maybe they have their personal laptops there. Well, not only do you have on that laptop that you might be using for work, all your work stuff, but what we're finding is that lots of employees also have data from their prior employers on their personal laptops that they might have brought over because it would be useful. And so you have this cascade of failure that is possible when a given workstation is compromised or that data starts to be stolen out, right? And then just to take it even further, we have this concept of all these organizations moving to the cloud. So legitimate cloud services like Google Apps and Office 365 give you secure ability to exfiltrate data to the cloud. And how do you, as a defender, notice, well, is that a valid use of Google Drive, or is that someone doing exfiltration over Google Drive and stealing all of our stuff? It's so difficult when you start to think of it in this aspect. And so looking for rogue actors becomes really tricky, especially talking about when they might be using authorized utilities such as Dropbox and the like there. So with all that, we have a really pretty good scenario for insider threats who want to steal stuff out of your organization or harm it in some ways, and a really rough time for defenders. And holistically, from a business perspective, obviously, trust is more important than monitoring, right? But even with that, even if you were to start to lock down the kinds of things your employees and staff can do, it still becomes really, really tricky because enforcing allow lists is really difficult to do without hindering productivity. And then again, going back to that authorized use, well, if you've allow listed Google Drive, well, what's to prevent someone from using that maliciously? And ultimately, people are really good at circumventing blocks. If you think of any school district that's ever had to try to lock down their internet and then just like wake up and realize that proxies are a thing, it's really hard to secure these sorts of these networks, especially when people want to do stuff. And for organizations that don't have full-time blue team defensive monitoring staffs, well, now you're just playing whack-a-mole in between all your other duties if you're an IT staffer, and that can be really tricky to do. And things like destination monitoring and deep packet inspection, yes, those can be very helpful, but it's also non-trivial to set up. And encryption is still pretty easy from an end user perspective. And again, going back to legitimate cloud services, what are you going to do? So with all that said about kind of the doomsday scenario we're living in from an insider threat perspective, well, what does this mean if you're looking at it as a red teamer? Well, the red team has some good news here. The red team can actually utilize all of these facts about the kinds of advantages that the insider threat has, and can utilize them in the red team engagement to help test the defenses and defenders inside of an organization. And there's an added benefit of pretty much everything that a red team might want to do to emulate an insider threat actor. You don't need exploitation for it because the end user probably doesn't have exploitation that they're going to use. And so you have all these benefits without any of the hindrances. And I love these kinds of tweets here that really reinforce the idea of as enterprises adopt hybrid clouds and all these sorts of things, well, what is the uptick in exfiltration of implants via these services, right? It's this sort of thing where you can now start to put yourself in a mindset, not only just as a malware author, but as a slightly motivated adversary. And by what I mean by slightly motivated adversary, it's a bit of an atomism, but someone who is technical enough to be dangerous, but not someone who can figure out how CVEs work, exfil data or exploit specific applications. So they have user space permissions, and they have access to valuable data, and they have public exfiltration tools, as an example. So you combine that all together, and you create, with your red team knowledge on top of it, a knowledge of ODAs and NDAs and automation and obfuscation and anonymity. You take all these things together, and it creates a really powerful scenario as a red team that you can say, oh, well, we're going to do some things as an insider threat. We have a lot of advantages there. However, it's really important to use the balance beam of adversary emulation versus a pen test. And the example I gave here with these images is that an adversary emulation is about finding the weaknesses in the doors and then helping to repair them, instead of often what pen tests can be is someone just kicks the door in and say, oh, it was a pretty weak door. All right, good luck. We'll see you in 6 months, right? And so for the sake of this discussion, when we're talking about adversary emulation, we're talking about specific behavior testing, post-exploitation, and focusing on the various properties that your defender might notice, such as exfiltration and lateral movement and heartbeat beacons with jitter, right? And focusing on those sorts of qualities and properties that the defenders need to notice, that's the adversary emulation for the sake of this conversation. And so we lean much more on, we need to lean much more on fixing the doors rather than just kicking the door in. You know, and these things do have cost. It isn't exactly easy to set up an adversary emulation plan. It's not something you can do quickly. It tends to be a little more difficult to outsource in many cases because there's so many pen testing firms that really don't have this organic adversary emulation plan up and running yet. There definitely are organizations that do that, but it's a little trickier to find. But keep in mind that there's cost benefits for all these things. So for example, a penetration test gives you a snapshot in time. It shows you on this given week, whenever the engagement occurred, these are the weaknesses we discovered, and so on and so forth, right? Which is useful, but if you then want to remediate and test it again in 2 weeks, or the next week, or again in a month, and have these sorts of things regularly, most pen testing firms don't set up for that kind of interval. Whereas when you're setting up adversary emulation, whether it's internally or with a third party, you can actually set up these kinds of intervals for remediations. And that's really important. Now, the goals for an adversary, in the case of a red team being an insider threat, is about defining a handful of things. So they define the crown jewels or assets that the insider threat might be going after or trying to steal, the techniques, and not necessarily the explicit execution, but the general idea of, well, what methods is this internal adversary going to use? And then you can start to think about the execution bits after that. But what general techniques are they going to be using? And then taking those and trying to make a repeatable plan out of them. And having repeatability is really critical here. This is something that a lot of red teams kind of overlook sometimes, where you spend all this time defining a plan, you execute it, and then you're done, and you put it in the bag as something you recorded, and now you move on to the next new thing. Instead, I would recommend that we identify these crown jewels, we identify the techniques we want to use to gather them, and then we define that repeatability plan so that you can modify the kinds of execution based off those techniques. But you can still do it over and over and over again and allow the defenders a chance to remediate their actions and then test for those fixes, right? And so repeatability is really critical here. And again, because you're doing this from an insider threat perspective, there's no requirement for Kali Linux or Metasploit here. You don't need to necessarily take a class on those sorts of compromise tools, because when you're emulating an insider threat, well, they probably wouldn't be using those things either. And so you can really kind of tone down the level of technical knowledge you need on any given thing and focus more on those behaviors, which is really critical. So, the blue team perspective, what do we do now with that in mind? It's so easy, especially when we're talking about adversary emulation and red teams and this sort of thing, to kind of forget the headaches that a given blue team might have to go through. And here I use this picture of Where's Waldo, right? Well, Where's Waldo is interesting because it's, you're trying to find Waldo. So you're trying to find the insider threat in all of the normal, right? The baseline of what's happening in the given picture. But what a lot of people, it's easy to forget. the folks doing stuff around Waldo, it's bonkers. Like, there's really wacky stuff. Like, there's a person wearing a top hat riding an octopus and like all this sorts of things. And it's so easy to forget that finding an insider threat or abnormal behavior in a sea of normal is a crazy prospect when we think about it. Because what is normal inside of a given network? What is normal when you're trying to baseline your user behaviors? Because people are random. Not everybody works 9 to 5, right? Some people log in the middle of the night, get a bunch of work done, or upload a bunch of documents they forgot to do during the day. Well, now they're uploading stuff outside of the normal time window. Is that normal? Should we be blocking them? These sorts of logical exercises are crazy. And trying to increase your signal to noise is really tricky to do, ultimately. Now, there are some outliers, right? So, for example, DNS. Well, DNS traffic is a pretty sound thing. You have a pretty normal flow of what DNS might be doing in your organization. You know what kinds of DNS servers, that probably the on-prem ones maybe, that they should be using versus what rogue DNS might be looking like. So these are sort of things you can baseline. Another one is looking at logs or endpoint logs. So, for example, PowerShell. Does anyone in the HR department ever need to use the word PowerShell, right? These are baselines that you can set to help increase that signal to noise ratio there. And so even though the blue team is likely drowning in all of the craziness that they have to analyze, especially from a network perspective, they can absolutely start to set these baselines and scale up those defenses and monitoring. So maybe you start with a rogue actor using a USB drive from a defensive perspective, and you're looking for weird events in that world. And then you can start to move your way all the way towards the advanced persistent threat with an admin, right? So you don't have to knock it all out of the park. And initially, you can start to set those baselines and iterate slowly, because even slight tweaks are really important. And beginning to grow this process at the right pace is really important. And that's true regardless of the maturity of your organization. It's really critical that you take steps at the right pace and not try to overshoot it, because that will lead you into weird scenarios where it's like, well, this is really hard to do. I guess we should just buy a thing, right, and be done with it. That temptation, there might be a point where you reach that maturity and you do realize you need to buy a tool, but you can still start slow, both from SOC and a blue team perspective. However, there are some really tricky bits when it comes to looking at, especially network analysis, right? And this is one of the kind of difficult hurdles that network monitors have to overcome, because you say you want to look at heartbeat beacons, like weird heartbeats or whatever, and forgetting about destination of the traffic or anything like that, but just heartbeats and beacons as a thing. Well, it's probably pretty easy to notice a single endpoint beaconing back to some weird place on Linode or DigitalOcean every 5 seconds, right? You could probably pick that out with some even rudimentary analysis of a network. Great. But what if you then take that same beacon and increase it to 20 seconds with a 20% jitter? Okay, you could probably notice that. That's in an easy enough interval where you could dump some PCAPs and pick that out of the crowd. But what if you start to increase that? What if you now design a piece of custom malware that, again, you put in the allow list and detonate on an endpoint, and it has a heartbeat beacon of 5 minutes with 75% jitter? Well, it gets a little trickier to notice that sort of thing, right? And you start to have more and more and more log aggregation in order to run that sort of analysis. And ultimately, you'll probably reach a line in the sand where this is no longer in the realm of feasibility for you, where it says, oh, well, if we want to look for heartbeat beacons of 30 minutes with 100% jitter, is that even something in scope for your organization? Is that even something you could possibly keep enough logs to do without dumping your entire IT budget into a log aggregator? That's an important reality check to give yourself every once in a while, because you may actually reach an upper bounds of the kind of threat actor you can detect. And yes, it's easy to say, oh, well, reverse TCP shells, if they were using Metasploit, they're not beaconing home every 30 minutes. That's not inside of our threat model. Sure, that's great. But when you look at state actors, a 30-minute beacon, that's nothing, right? When you're looking at threat actors that focus in years or potentially decades for their campaigns, they might just beacon back once a week or once a month. And so that's just frankly outside the scope of most organizations from a defensive and from a monitoring perspective. And so it's important to keep those things in mind. And again, it's about what is kind of a worst case scenario, sure, but what's a realistic case of something you could notice, right? And then finding anomalies based on them. And beware, anomaly detection is tricky, because if there's a user who's been uploading a gig of data to Dropbox every day at midnight for years, well, maybe there's a reason for that. And you have to be able to validate those assumptions and build on those assumptions over time. So it's worth noting really quick about breach and attack simulation as a thing, because we're talking about adversary emulation, we're talking about insider threats. There's a lot of valid stuff to be found in breach and attack simulation tools. But when it comes to insider threats, and with other kinds of threats as well, but we need to be a little cautious. So fast tools really live in a space of repeatable scenarios that are automatically executed. They're usually running as agents on endpoints, and they sit there forever, and they go, 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 go. And these function really well for regression tests, as an example. So, or unit testing is another way to think about it. So the value there is, is our firewall? Are we blocking known bad domains because of our threat intel that was fed? And if we update the firewall, make sure that those rules are still fixed. Breach and attack simulation tools work very, very well. And it's worth noting that they're not implants, right? They are functioning as an agent on an endpoint, often in a lab, not a production environment, which has pros and cons to it. But generally speaking, when something's running as an agent in a lab environment, it's not being a real user. It's not doing that adversary scenario. It's just making sure that based on threat intel, the given destinations and firewall rules and regression tests for your defenses are working as expected, which is very valuable. But from the process of, would we notice insider threats, breach and attack simulations tools are kind of outside the scope, because if they're just repeating known PCAPs or known bad domains and testing for known signature traffic, well, you're kind of taking the human element out of things. And that human element is really critical here when we're thinking about insider threats, because it's not just about this known threat actor and all the MITRE ATT&CK IDs that are associated with them. It's about a slightly motivated attacker using the tools they have in front of them to perform or steal or whatever those bad actors might be doing, from that bad actor, what they might be wanting to do. And often that could be for financial gain or theft of data or cyber espionage and what have you. But again, these things tend to be a little out of scope for the breach and attack simulation tools, mostly because there's lots of unknowns with how those insider threats are going to be focusing on. And if you only focus on the known knowns, you're probably not encompassing what an insider threat actor might be doing. And it's worth noting as well that there's a lot of tools out there that say, based on AI and machine learning, we can absolutely analyze your logs and network and detect these sorts of anomalies and that sort of thing. And I love this quote about the difference between machine learning and AI. If it's written in Python, it's probably machine learning. If it's written in if it's written in PowerPoint, it's probably AI. That sort of thing is very funny, but it's also worth noting that there are flaws with machine learning when it comes to anomaly detection as well, and especially with organizations that may already be compromised. So going back to that scenario where, this user's been backing up a gig of data to Dropbox every day for the last 3 years. Well, if you bring in an anomaly detector and it's doing its baseline week or what have you, well, it'll probably see that graphic and say, it's always been that way. So I guess that's okay, right? So tread carefully when you're trying to roll out these sorts of tools, because there are flaws in anomaly detection based on kind of the randomness of humans that we've talked about a few times now. And especially when you accidentally learn from a compromised network, that's really tricky. And here I would highly recommend, and this is true for all vendors, but validating your vendors and the tools that they're offering you is really critical. do spend the time to kick the tires on things if you have the opportunity, because it doesn't do you any good to buy something that says on paper, oh yes, we of course look for this, because you need to validate that. And we see this a lot in the world at large, especially if you're looking at something like ransomware detection. So as a brief kind of side story, it doesn't really have to do with the insider threat here, but if you buy an EDR that looked for ransomware behavior, right? Well, how do you know that it actually does that detection without actually maybe creating your own ransomware and detonating? Because, and this is something we've seen in the wild, where you might create some custom ransomware that is benign, but still does some file deletion, even though it might be deleting arbitrary files. But if an EDR says it defends against ransomware, it doesn't catch your bespoke ransomware when it's behaving and it's been allow listed, well, then there might be a blind spot there that you thought you would solve, but didn't, right? And who knows? Maybe it's based on canary files or whatever. It doesn't matter. But the idea is you should be validating your defenses and your defenders and validating the vendors you're trusting with the claims they're making. And this is really important, especially from anomaly detection and network detection. And then, hopefully that translates well into looking for insider threats that are in a chaotic user space from a monitoring perspective. So we've talked about all sorts of things, the value of looking at things as an insider threat actor, the value that it brings to a red team that wants to perform these sorts of exercises, some of the trials that a blue team has to go through in order to make these things work. So how do we then take all this and turn it into something meaningful that maybe you could do as a purple team engagement? And again, from our perspective here, you don't need to have the word purple team in your resume necessarily, as that's your specific role. For most organizations, there is no specific purple teamers, but instead just an exercise as the red and the blue team working together, because the red team can't exist without the blue, right? The red team's goal is to validate the defenses and defenders easily, repeatably, and with some level of transparency so that the entire organization can be better defended. So looking at that flow from a purple team perspective, what can we do? This is something that I can't recommend enough. And there's all sorts of ways that you can think about this technically or not, or what kind of tooling you use to do this or not. But I highly recommend, and it's not even just like a tabletop exercise, but it's something that literally you could gather the teams around the table and run the following kind of assessment. I call them joint risk and priority assessments. And the idea is that based on the knowledge that everyone in the team could bring to the table, the team could collectively find a low priority, high priority of the kinds of defenses and threat emulation that they should be performing as a team. So, for example, the high priority item might be something that is both easy to catch and has high risk. So let's, as an example of that, would you notice if someone exfiltrated all of the data on the shared drive inside of 15 minutes, right? That is a massive exfiltration event. You should probably notice a single endpoint trying to exfil that amount of data, regardless of the server they're using. That's just a lot of weird traffic. So, exfilling a terabyte of data in an hour over the network, like that's a really bizarre thing. But would you notice that? Well, I would put that as a high priority part of a high priority item in this joint assessment, because although it seems silly, right, threat actors probably aren't going to do that. Maybe we think this intellectually. You should unequivocally be able to notice someone exfilling a terabyte of data out of your network, right? That's the kind of thing where it's almost like a quick win or a low-hanging fruit from a red team, blue team perspective. And now just taking that one example, the team gets to work together, right? You can say, what kind of tool should we use to try to exfiltrate a terabyte of data or simulate a terabyte of exfil off of our network? And you can collaborate and say, well, maybe we'll use Dropbox for that together. And then the red team has to go forth and do their side. Well, if you're going to be using Dropbox for this engagement, the red team needs to figure out a repeatable way to test for that much exfiltration over Dropbox, right? And it becomes a shared exercise. And then once both teams are ready, The red team has defined the tactics they want to use and the kinds of methods they're going to do it, and the crown jewels, in this case, that terabyte of data, and they can fire for effect. And now the blue team can see, oh, did we actually set up our monitors in that way to notice this sort of behavior? And then because it's repeatable, you could say, okay, we either noticed it or we didn't, let's try it again. Okay, maybe we've really got it nailed down and we noticed it over Dropbox, let's try over Google Drive today. Right? And then you can slowly change these things over time and grow these capabilities organically together as a team. And that's really important. And as you get the low-hanging fruit or those things that would be very disastrous but also probably easier to catch, you can move down into, again, for the sake of this slide, the lower priority items, right? Getting it to the point where, would you notice somebody exfilling a meg over the course of a week? Well, it's really hard to do, but you're still looking at a more advanced persistent threat in that way. And so moving in that direction slowly is really important. And that takes you from the sense of, oh, what we want to focus on right now is a disgruntled staffer and the kinds of things that they would do in the heat of a moment as to be as harmful as possible very quickly. And focusing those things, focusing on those behaviors and those techniques from a red and blue team perspective is really critical. And so, again, that it's really important for the entire team to do this together and to be transparent about the kinds of tests that they want to perform. So this is one answer that I recommend most folks think about doing, at least as a joint team, whether it's the IT staff coming together or the red and the blue team. Regardless of your level of maturity, you could still run through these exercises and do that cost-benefit analysis and analyze the risk for your organization, because you know your crown jewels and you know the size of that data and you know some of the methods that someone would maybe take to steal those things. And then you can work on finding the defenses and validating the defenses that are associated with those. All right, so to summarize, employees are the best hackers. I think this is a Bryson Bork quote, if memory serves. But I do love that context, especially now there's so much work from home in the world. It's really tricky, and there's a lot of trust that we have to put on employees, rightfully so. But when it comes to insider threat actors, it's kind of a nightmare scenario. And so given that employees can be the best hackers and they can be the slightly motivated adversary, what do we do with that? Well, the red team can focus on these sorts of threat emulations that are post-exploitation. They don't have to worry about what O days or N days are being utilized. And the focus is on testing the network and endpoint monitors and using those insider threat tactics to validate those things. And be the controls validators for the organization, right? And make sure that everything that the red team is doing is being done in a repeatable adversary testing way. Make sure that anything can be modified, but that these things are actually being conducted in a way that you can do over and over and over again. Then focusing on the blue team's role in all this is to baseline what is normal to whatever degree is possible, and then shoring up those fundamentals. And again, we can think about it in the terms of network norms or logging norms, or making sure that the log aggregation is getting everything you expect it to. What is a standard and what is abnormal, and slowly refining those over time, that's the critical component. And then once both teams kind of have a good, solid understanding of these, we can focus on the purple team. So you now have a baseline, you now have repeatable adversary plans. Let's try to utilize these together as the red and blue teams to look for outliers or create outliers. Traffic at weird times, at weird intervals, from weird locations, at weird amounts, and just whatever kind of non-standard tool usage might be at. Again, going back to does anyone in HR need to run PowerShell under any circumstances? Probably not, right? And there are normal bounds of that. It's easy to look at something like a MITRE ATT&CK ID for network discovery, right, or network configuration discovery, which is like T1124 or system time discovery. Well, there's all these sorts of things that it's easy to focus on. Like, ooh, we want to go after that specific threat actor ID and that specific technique. But you can't block the system calls for ARP queries across your entire network. Nothing will work, right? And there's lots of valid reasons that a given application or user may query Windows time. So instead of focusing on these things and trying to cover the entire MITRE attack matrix grid, focus on what is normal and abnormal. And most folks that are hopefully listening to this and are working towards these exercises have even a gut understanding of those things. You have a really good idea of what your users do and do not need on any given moment. So you can use that to analyze baseline and create outliers, again, depending on your routine perspective. And with that, I'm done. I've put the slides up there. There's a bit.ly link to them. I've left some time for questions, so we can do that. I actually have a sources page at the end of this. And you obviously, if you take the slides, you get all the slides themselves and all the speaker notes that I was going off of as well. So yeah, that's we're done.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That was great.
Well, that was helpful. And thanks again to the Walrus Hackfest team for inviting me to be part of this, roundup. This is such a cool thing, and I'm really honored and flattered that I got to be part of this. So thank you.
Awesome. No, thank you for coming and presenting and not talking about products and selling stuff and actually dropping knowledge. I think that's what the audience has come to expect. So you've delivered once again. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And it's, it is, that's one of the values of this audience is that, it's not only a wide swath of technical skill set, but it's also folks that are just like, oh, well, let's see what kind of interesting, weird stuff and of all sorts of different. I mean, obviously, my talk was completely non-technical, right? Like, I don't think I showed a single command in there, really, beyond the who am I on my bio page. But hopefully, there's value to be found by either, folks that are non-technical and looking to get started, or technical folks that are trying to sell insider threat behavior exercises inside their organization. So
exactly. No, and some good comments coming in here. Ghost 305, assume breach is my new motto when approaching all this. I start from post-exploitation.
Yeah.
And
I mean, why not? Really, it's when you start to think about it, it's like, well, of course we should be focusing on the behaviors post-exploitation. Like, of course. But yeah, I mean, I don't need to convince you to. It's
right. Well, Joff just gave a talk on that as well, and you know my stance on that. No, but this has been awesome. Those memes, though, like I think those memes won. I think they won the presentation so far. No offense to your memes, Joff, but the whole Waldo one and the Big Bird one. I think that one.
That was really cool. That was really cool.
Well, thank you. I mean. But it was funny. The Waldo analogy kind of hit me like a lightning bolt one day, and I'm like, wait a second. The people in Waldo's world, they're weird. Like, they're doing weird stuff all the time. So if you get an opportunity, just thumb through some of these things, because there's some bonkers art going on in the background of those.
Yeah, no, for sure. And who do we have? Do we have Jeff on? Is he? No.
I don't think
no. I'm here. I'm here.
Oh, yes, here. Okay.
There you are. Awesome. Yeah, you get to partake in our banter now between.
Yeah,
Adam.
no, it was fun. I was happy to have Adam say something I always say. You got to start slow. You got to have just enough security to start if you're building from nothing, because so many orgs I've seen just overwhelmed, try to do all the tactics at once. They build their big dashboard of what can we catch, and I'm like, no, don't start there.
Right.
So
it's not a bingo card.
Not.
And if it is, it's all red right now. It's not a good look.
Do you know, if I was consulting with any organization, the first thing I'd probably say to them is just start off by centralizing your logging. That's it. Start right there. Right? Just get things in a place where you have some visibility, then start building from there.
Exactly.
Because, a lot of folks, they're not even close to even that point, right? Or as we've said before, I mean, the sort of first principle question: do you guys know what assets are in your network? Can you name all of your software and your hardware and your? Can you actually, like,
that
tell us?
critical control number one?
Yeah, pretty much. Can you name your assets? And if you can't do that, then your elite security program is going to have to wait, right? Let's start building the basics.
It is tricky though, because it forces folks to have these reality checks, and now I think we're going to see it more and more, especially when people are listening to talks like what's been happening today. It's like all of a sudden they might wake up one day and be like, oh, even though we're really worried about state actors, we do not have anywhere near the mechanisms, budget, staffing to even come close to really being able to detect a state actor inside of our organization. And like admitting that to yourself and to your leadership and potentially to your board, like that is a really scary thing. But having that reality check of being like, no, like don't focus on state actors. Like centralize your logs. Like do you notice PowerShell in places PowerShell shouldn't be going? Like forget overseas. Like focus on today, right now.
Yeah, and Jeff, you have experience with that, right? You work at a company doing services that you get to talk and see what a whole bunch of people are doing.
Yeah, no, we do. And our big thing is we're a big ex-military, a lot of veterans there, a lot of ex-intelligence, nation-statey type people there. So it's fun, but no, I mean, you're right. Like acknowledging that as a first step is important. And like Joff said, if you know where your critical assets are, well, maybe you can't detect an APT in any system, every system in the network, but maybe you can at least know, how secure is our crown jewels, and we can actually tighten that down first, and really try to lock that down. But yeah, no, it's fun. We get to go to lots of different orgs, and we help them build these systems out sometimes. So we get to play red and blue together with the existing blue team to kind of teach them, get monitoring up in place to get them started. So they get over that initial hurdle of having too much to look at right away.
That's awesome. It's like you almost go in and build a program for them for doing the testing, the tuning, and you get them going, and then come back kind of for maintenance and to up the sophistication levels.
Yeah. We had one company that had a big Ryoku ransomware event, and we show up and they ask what can we do better. First problem, flat network. Just all sorts of architectural issues. So we work with them over, improving their architecture a little bit, adding centralized logging, which while we're talking about that, consistent timestamps. I don't know if anybody's had to work IR before directly, but if you're threat hunting or you're looking at logs, having consistent timestamps is key. So we set that up for them, had them run it for a bit, and then came in and actually we used Vector. We used Vector to build out the attack plan and kind of show them and work through them actually detecting us or not, and giving them a grade at the end to help them improve. And it's a good time.
Yeah, we love us some Vector as well, and the folks over at SRA, they making it the platform free and accessible to everyone. I think that's fantastic, and really something. Well, we've all talked, right? Scythe believes in this. Black Hills, obviously, and you guys as well, right? You have a number of free tools and stuff out there, right?
Yeah, we do. Actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to show one real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay,
if
cool.
It's free, I think everyone's going to love it.
So let's see if it's going to show the right screen. Hopefully it did. Show my screen.
Yeah, we can see something.
All right, cool. You should see what is Cryptbreaker on the main page.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Okay, awesome. So talking about insider threats and issues, frequently if you already have an assumed breach scenario, you have access to the network, the Windows domain, and time again, we see the primary, the primary way that people are getting around is they're just abusing legitimate management protocols. Like you might have the best EDR in the world that catches my Cobalt Strike, but if I RDP onto a system, Cobalt Strike really doesn't care what I do at that point because CrowdStrike doesn't care. I'm a user using the system. So to help organizations kind of audit passwords and find flaws in their password selection and policy and implementation, we created a tool called Cryptbreaker. A lot of organizations may not have the hardware. They may only have a blue team and not a red team that is, traditionally going to be doing password cracking, building the fun rigs. So what this is this builds upon the existing capabilities of Amazon, AWS, to use spot-priced instances for graphics cards accelerated cracking. So you can do cracking, and instead of having to have an upfront cost of buying and building a rig and having that just running in the back somewhere when you're not using it, you only pay for cracking when you need it, exactly how long it's running. And another big problem with password audits is that frequently you have a concern that once a password has been compromised, you can't be sure that somebody on the blue team who may be able to see it isn't going to abuse that credential. You have that concern about how that credential is going to be stored and handled. So the way this tool actually works is there's the ability to the local web application that you run just on any system, doesn't need a lot of power. And what it does is it configures a whole bunch of settings in Amazon for you. And then you upload files to your local database. But when you actually go to crack, it uploads only hashes to S3, to a private bucket, does the cracking. Once the cracking is done, first off, while the cracking's happening, there is no way for anybody to sign into the system. There's no SSH, there's no keys, there's no anything. So it's an isolated instance, does the cracking, and you configure whether you want the plain text credentials to leave the instance or not. So you can make it so the only place where the cracked password plain text exists is on the cracking box when the cracking is occurring. And then you can exfiltrate back out and to your local database an actual copy of all the cracked credentials. But it will mask them. It will do things like, say, replace uppercase with an uppercase U, lowercase with a lowercase L, and you can get analytics on passwords and complexity and all those good things. I'm trying to see if I have a screenshot in here. Analytics with passwords and complexity and all those good things without actually ever revealing the secrets. So this little GIF will show you the complete installation. It should also show at the end a little sample report idea. But yeah, so you can crack passwords, you can audit them, only pay for cracking time. You don't need to worry about word lists if you don't want to. Does all the installation for you and protects, as best as possible the credentials so that no human actually has access to them. If that's what your organization is looking to do. And again, it's meant to be really simple. You don't have to know much more other than having an AWS account and having the money to pay for it.
Yeah, and it sounds way more cost effective than buying a $25,000 password cracking rig, right?
Yeah, no, it totally is. I'm gonna go back to this. I think this has the GIF. So
cards.
Cracking is a service.
No, I mean it's always fun. There's a new video game coming out, later next month involving cyber in the title. I like having an old rig that I can use, but this is way faster for me. Yeah, it's cheap. It's a few dollars an hour max. And you can see you can do redaction. So I'll stop sharing and bring it back to you. But we're passionate.
Fantastic. No, that's super cool. And we got a question here around MPK. What are the differences between those?
So the main difference, and actually that's a really good question. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you don't have to see that the whole time. Stop sharing screen. Cool. So the main difference, one thing is NPK didn't actually exist when I built this. So I think I beat them by like a month or something. The second is NPK's primary audience, from everything I've seen, is going to be offensive professionals trying to crack and recover hashes. That's the audience. There is no way to use that tool and not expose the plain text credentials. So for me, a big goal of this was to design it securely, using all the features of Amazon to say the credentials will only ever exist in plain text on a system while it's running, and then it goes away. Also, NPK is entirely cloud hosted. So you run their script and it sets it up in AWS using DynamoDB and a whole bunch of other cool capabilities. But this tool only actually uses Amazon resources when you're actively cracking. Other than that, it's a local database, a local copy. You can keep it internal to your organization. And
that is huge for OPSEC. Take a second and breathe about OPSEC, right? We all were raised doing this thing in OPSEC, but a lot of people come in and they just think that putting things everywhere is fine, but no, these are real credentials, right? And larger organizations probably don't want their credentials going out all over the place and whatnot.
Yeah. So, and to close the loop on the NPK thing, a future goal is going to be to have full feature parity with NPK. So hopefully you'll get to choose. It's really at that point just going to be, do you want it to be purely in the cloud or only in the cloud when you need it? And that'll be the main discerning factor then.
That's awesome, man. And it's completely free?
Yeah, completely free. No limitations on it. Right now, again, because the first primary focus is Windows password auditing, it only supports at the moment NTLM, NTLM v2, NetNTLM, and LM. But again, you don't need to install, secrets dump.py. You don't need to do any of that. It's all Dockerized. So you just install this, upload your zip file if you've made an install for media backup. Nobody ever sees anything sensitive if you don't want them to.
That's so cool, man.
Right,
thanks for giving that back to the community and sharing that. We appreciate that.
Of course.
So again,
There's so
that's
many people who's praying that their executives don't see this because they want to spend all that money on a cracking rig, and they're like, "Oh no, that tool? No, we don't talk about that tool."
it sends passwords to a cloud. You can't use it.
So one more thing on that. It does analytics on breach dump data too and stuff like that. So if you already have existing cracking rigs, the tool is also built to allow you to upload the cracked hash information as well as the pre-cracked hash information and get statistics still. So if you only wanted to use it for prettier reporting, you could still do that. And it has an API, so there's actually an integration to Cobalt Strike. So like mid-op, when I'm doing Cobalt Strike, I can actually shuttle hashes over and then tell them to crack and get them. So it's API based, so it has all that stuff too, if you want to extend it in some way.
That is fantastic, man. Thank you so much for presenting that here real quick. Again, that's Jeff with Open Security, and they're a services company. They're a sponsor, so we appreciate that. And dropping some knowledge and some free tools. It's like the best combination of everything here. So appreciate your time. And Adam, you as well. Thank you for your talk.